Good evening, everyone. I'm Jonathan Miller, Board Chair of Ithaca City of Asylum, and welcome to the first of 4 sessions of Odysseys, Ithaca Writers on Exile, Wandering, and Searching for Home. Tonight we'll hear from poet Gail Holst-Warhaft and playwright Aoise Stratford. The Odyssey theme resonates for Ithaca City of Asylum. If you've read the Odyssey, and don't worry if you haven't, you know that the hero Odysseus is from Ithaca. In fact, he's the king of Ithaca. He goes off to fight in the Trojan War, then he spends 10 years and 12,000 lines of dactylic hexameter trying to get back home to reunite with his wife and son. As you may have heard, it's quite an adventure. You might even call it epic, full of detours and wrong turns and weather delays and other experiences familiar to Ithacans to this day. Ithaca City of Asylum's main mission is to welcome and support writers on their Odysseys, people who have been forced to leave home and who need a new place to live and work. Typically, they've endured quite a bit by the time they get here. ICOA's first guest writer was the poet and activist Yi Ping from China, who arrived 20 years ago. Our 7th, Pedro Molina, is a cartoonist from Nicaragua. He's finishing 2.5 years with us this spring. It's still not safe for him and his family to go back home, so their Odyssey will continue. Another way in which the Odyssey's theme resonates for ICOA is that our organization now finds itself at one of those how are we going to get out of this one moments. Since 2012, we've had a wonderful arrangement with Ithaca College, which made a position available in its honors program for our resident writer with a salary and benefits and help with immigration. But the pandemic hit IC hard, and they can no longer offer that. And that puts our ability to host new writers in doubt. We're exploring our options. Let us know if you have ideas. And please consider helping financially if you're able. There's a donate link in the chat at the bottom of your window. Or go to our website, ithacacitydofasylum.com, and look for the donate button there. Meanwhile, we'll continue to fulfill the other part of our mission, which is to speak up for people who speak up, and to remind the broader community of the crucial role that writers and artists and other speaker-uppers play in our society and everywhere else. 1,000 thanks tonight to our friends and co-sponsors Buffalo Street Books, Global Cornell, the Cornell Migrations Initiative, Ithaca College Department of Writing, Odyssey Bookstore, Storyhouse Ithaca, and Tompkins County Public Library. Special thanks to Katie Fontana from the library, who's working the control room tonight. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's MC, David Guaspari, a mathematician and playwright and vice chair of the ICOA board. Thanks, David, and thanks to all of you for coming.
Thanks, John. The program, as John said, will be for Gail and Aoise to read some of their work. The 3 of us will chat, then the floor will be open for questions. Put your questions in the chat. First, some housekeeping. Things will look best in speaker view. The producer will have a spotlight on all the people who are speaking. If you do leave your cameras on, you will be visible to someone using the gallery view, so make that decision accordingly. There's no need to mute. You're already muted. Gail Holst-Warhaft has been a poet, translator, journalist, and academic, and a musician, having performed with Mikis Theodorakis, who's best known to American audiences for scoring the films Zorba the Greek and Serpico. She has a Ph.D. in Comparative Literature from Cornell, where she's taught courses on Mediterranean culture. She has published many translations of Greek literature, as well as books on Greek popular music, and collections of her own poems. She'll read some poems of her own and some translations from Theodorakis. Gail?
Thank you, David, and thank you, John. And hello, everybody. When you've spent your life writing about, teaching, and translating Greek literature and music, and you end up living in a town called Ithaca, it seems inevitable sooner or later to identify yourself with Penelope, the wife who waited for 20 years for her husband to return from the Trojan War. The poems that make up Penelope's Confession, that was my first published book of poems, were written partly as a response to the US invasion of Iraq. The Iliad and the Odyssey tell us that the armies of Greek-speaking people who set out to attack Troy were responding to the abduction of Helen, wife of the Spartan king Menelaus, by the Trojan prince Paris. But the reality was that Troy was known for its wealth, and Helen's abduction provided a welcome excuse for a massive pirate raid. Wars, then and now, are fought for gold or oil, not for an unfaithful wife. Some of the poems are set in contemporary Greece, some in the mythical landscape of Homer's poems. The book is bilingual. I translated some of the poems into Greek myself. Others were translated by Greek poets I had translated. The first poem is called The Late Spring. The spring is late, anemones keep shoots shut. Irises are reluctant to uncurl their panting tongues. A sluggishness has overcome the island, and tourists shiver in their crush-proof clothes. Penelope waits, but what she waits for, she can't say. Boats come and go, bringing supplies for a siege. Beer, bicycles, girls, bottled water that will last till October, wearing away the island's defenses. Behind the town, there is still life, but for how long? Villas climb, cleansing hillsides of olive and oak. Electric lines follow, roads where turtles are splayed like slow infantry. Away from the wind, in the lee of a hill, she stops to look at the raw sky, the clenched buds at her feet. She desires nothing more than this waiting, the promise kept back, deferred, the late spring. For those of you not so familiar with the Odyssey, the poem that follows depends on knowing that when his master returned in disguise, Odysseus's old dog Argos recognized him, wagged his tail, and died. The poem is called Fidelity. The dog died in the night. One twitch of a mangy tail was enough to loose its hold on life. Years ago, she had tired of its fidelity. Dogs try too hard, she thinks. They wear their doggy hearts out, waiting for masters to return. She drinks her coffee under the carob. Its pods clack in the wind. She's begun to hate the way her name rattles off the tongue. Penelope, Fidelity, 2 seeds in a dry pod. She's become an antidote for adultery, Helen's counterpoise. When all this becomes myth, what woman worth her lover's salt will wish herself Penelope? For another's infidelity, she's lived her life on the threshold, slave to the harlot, hope. She's led a dog's life. Again, I'll remind you that on his decade-long voyage back to Ithaca after the sack of Troy, Odysseus told tales about his own adventures. When he reached Ithaca, he was disguised with Athena's help as a beggar. Helen of Troy and Clytemnestra, also another thing you need to know, were supposedly twin sisters born to Leda after she'd been raped by Zeus in the guise of a swan. The poem's called The Cost of Wandering. The cost of wandering was loss of trust, even in her. Why else would he tell such tales about himself, camouflaged, scratching his scabby beard, testing? Didn't he see she was no swan-spawned harpy like Helen and her sister? But then he'd failed to know the land he'd sailed toward and thought it one more strange island. Disguise put on once too often had dulled his vision so that the man of many turns couldn't make the last return to himself, the inward spiral that would lead him back to her. He'd charmed kings, cheated sirens, hidden under sheep, hoodwinked one-eyed giants, but she saw through the man he'd been to the man he was, the wanderer who'd outfoxed himself. The only thing you need to know about the poem that follows is that after he'd been abused by the suitors who thought he was an aged beggar, Odysseus defeated them in a contest with his bow, and then, with his son's help, set about slaughtering not only all the suitors, but the women who had slept with them. And the poem is called The Wooden Horse. and it has an epigraph. The lowest is to attack a city. It's from Duns 2. Before that night, the horse was a high point of minstrels' tales, especially that part where the belly splits and instead of entrails, the Greeks spew out into the sleeping streets and take Troy by stealth, ending the 9-year siege. The poets didn't mention the sound the city made as it died, or the smell that rose from its streets after the soldiers had satisfied their lust for blood and turned to sex. Last night, her house was a mini Troy, its rooms shrieking, its killer her spouse. Next morning, by the sea, she raises her sticky shift over her head and swims, letting her mind and body drift under the brightening sky. At the sea's edge, she stands, rubbing her body, removing the stench of her husband's hands. So Athena put a spell over Penelope so that she would sleep and not witness the slaughter of the suitors and her former serving maids. Odysseus and his son had reserved a more painful death for the women than the men. They were strangled on a rope stretched across the courtyard. The following poem is said at that moment when Penelope wakes from her drugged sleep. It's called A Souvenir. Still fuddled by sleep, she walks out of the courtyard to where the women lie, threaded like linnets on a hunter's belt. Flies crawl in their nostrils and open eyes. She tastes bile and speaks their names one by one, as if naming were a way to keep them safe from rough hands. Hero, Hermione, Iphigenia, Irene, Leda, Leucothea, Eriso, Europa, Maya, soft souls caught in the snare of their own desires. She kneels to remove a slipper that has taken the shape of a foot, each toe mounded as if by a burrowing mole. This is all that will last of pretty Maya, a shoe that danced the night away, a slipper whose mate no prince will seek, Penelope's keepsake. The last poem I'll read from Penelope's confession imagines Penelope back at her loom after Odysseus leaves. Penelope's blues. Penelope is at work again. This time her warp and weft are blue, two shades so close they merge into a single essence of blueness like the sea, sky, and mountains of summer that defy the eye's desire for delimited zones. Into this shimmer, she works a single ship, the lone figure in the prow a woman, hair streaming behind, breasts bared, a touch of Carmen on the open lips that seem to be singing a siren's song, the blues. As I mentioned, I spent a lot of my time translating modern Greek and sometimes ancient Greek poetry and prose. In another life, I was a musician and played in the orchestra of Greece's most famous composer, Mikis Theodorakis, about whose life and music I published a book in 1980. Last year, I translated and published a collection of Theodorakis' poems and song lyrics under the title, The House with the Scorpions. In the 1940s, Theodorakis was repeatedly tortured and imprisoned for his left-wing beliefs. One of the first proclamations of the military junta that took power in the coup d'etat of 1967 was to place a complete ban on the music of Theodorakis. People were jailed for simply playing one of his songs on a record player. After spending nearly 4 months in hiding, the composer was caught and sent to the notorious Bouboulines prison. He'd become internationally famous then for his film scores for Zorba and Serpico, and was not tortured or executed as he expected, but he was forced to listen to the sounds of fellow prisoners being savagely beaten. He devised a code to communicate with a prisoner in the next cell and pushed it through the bars on a visit to the toilet. Here are two of the poems from the cycle Songs for Andreas. We are two. We are two, the clock strikes 8, turn off the lights, the guard knocks, tonight they'll come again. One in front, the other behind, then silence and the same old story. They strike once, they strike 3 times, 1,013. You are in pain, and so am I, but which of us suffers more? Only time will tell. We are 2, we are 3, we are 1,013. We ride on into time, in time, with the rain, the blood clots on the wound, and pain becomes a nail. Avenger, savior, we are 2, we are 3, we are 1,013. This one's called The Slaughterhouse. At noon, they beat someone in the office. I count the blows, I measure the blood. I am the fattened beast. They've shut me in the slaughterhouse. Today you, tomorrow me. They beat Andreas on the terrace. I count the blows, I measure the pain. We'll meet again behind the wall. Tap, tap you, tap, tap me, which means in this dumb language, I'm holding on well. In our hearts, the feast begins. Tap, tap you, tap, tap me. Our slaughterhouse smelled of time, and our cell, red sky. I'll end on a somewhat more cheerful note with a poem from Australia. Aisha and I are both Australians, and I was delighted to be reading with an Australian writer. And our ending up in Ithaca in New York is something of an odyssey in itself. Years ago, I flew to Melbourne from Greece. It was a sobering experience to fly over the country from west to east and realizing how little of it I knew. And the poem's from a collection called Lucky Country. This poem is called Looking Down on the Lucky Country. We fly all day over desert. No wonder the second comers who tried to cross it died. The colors are faded paint. Rivers snake like sidewinders, then stop. The country gave itself grudgingly to the ones who came and stayed in the Stone Age. They knew only one secret mattered, water, and where to find it. So they sang their way across the land, memorizing each source, bequeathing a map for survival from one generation to the next, stopping to greet members of their totem, passing on. Near the coast, browns turn green, iron roofs wink in the sun, highways lead to a busy city. If the sea should rise and take a bite out of this coast, it would all be gone. This crust of settlement where we grew up, ignorant of the whole, thinking we knew it. Thank you.
So Aoise Stratford is a dramaturg, writer, and lecturer at Cornell. Her plays have won several awards and been produced at theaters around the world, including London's National Theatre and the Seymour Centre in Sydney, Australia. She won the 2012 Susan Glaspell Award for her play, The Unfortunates. Many Ithacans will have seen her adaptation of A Christmas Carol at the Hanger Theatre or heard one of her headphone walking plays for the Cherry. So, Aisha?
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm just making sure I can be heard well enough. Yes, good. Okay, great. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from a play called Oracle. And this is a play that's about journeys and has been long in the making. So it's something of an Odyssey itself. And most of the characters are in various ways on difficult journeys to unknown territory. And some of them are in the process of redefining home. Others are trying to find it. So restlessness and freedom and knowledge about where we're headed, and the difficulty of communicating across the sort of vast expanses that divide us are the recurring themes of the play. I'm going to read a few little pieces from different parts of the play, so just to give a flavor of it. So what I'll do is in scenes with 2 characters, I'll announce the speaker before the line so you can track who's talking. The play is set in San Francisco, which is a city with a rich history of itinerant travelers, including myself. And the action of the play takes place mostly now, but time is not a straightforward thing in this play. And bits of the past and the future kind of drift in and out of the present with no respect for the niceties of temporal borders. So as the play opens, a character who's just called the People, this is one person called the People, kind of sets this up for us. She says, "The world might end at any moment. All along the slippery and fickle continuum of time, this is true. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, everything might change. Once the bridge cracked, spilling cars and people into the sea, streets have been known to ripple like water, buildings crumble like sandcastles, fires alight out of nowhere. As it has been, so it might be again. And this uncomfortable half-knowledge beats restlessly in the hearts of the drunks and dot-commers, the gold rushers and the seekers who have come to the city by the bay. So one of the play's three central characters is a character called Hunter, and he hears the voice of the Delphic oracle. He's an unwilling prophet who occasionally sees things in dreams and not usually good things. Persecuted in his hometown in Northern California for his unexplained knowledge about a local drowning, he traveled to San Francisco incognito to get away from the past and sort of stay off the radar. When the play begins, he's using his prophetic skills to eke out a living for himself and a young runaway called Moonboy by calling a rigged bingo game. So he uses the oracle to predict numbers in advance and has people bet on the outcome. And this has been going really well, but at the beginning of the play, this is about to change. We're in Hunter's apartment, a faded parlor in a rundown building. Hunter sits at his dressing table and lights a joint. Through the smoke, the oracle appears behind him. They stare at each other in the mirror. Oracle. Vessel, Hunter says. I'm not playing until tomorrow. Oracle. Vessel of truth. The hour approaches. It is time to open yourself to the will. Reach beyond the number to be once more the instrument of the people. Hunter. Oh, no. No, thank you if you prefer, but still no. Oracle. Man cannot stand at the gate of truth facing south. Hear me, Hunter. Hunter. I'll hear you if you come back tomorrow and whisper sweet numbers in my ear as usual, but... Oracle. A traveler comes, weary from walking under Apollo's gaze. The sun is dropping over the hill, darkness descends. You are the torchbearer. Pick up the torch and guide her. Hunter. We do bingo. That's it. Oracle. You knew this day would come. Hunter. No, you said it would come, and that's not the same thing. Oracle. The dragon has slept, and we have passed the time with your amusements, but now you must make the last climb to the summit. It is your destiny, as it was mine. Hunter. I don't do destiny. If people want destiny, they can read their horoscopes in the Chronicle. Wouldn't it just be easier for both of us if we took a rain check on the weary, truth-seeking travelers and the visions and riddles and just stuck to bingo? I'm asking you as nicely as I know how. Let the dragon sleep, yes? Oracle. There is no sleep without dreaming. Your gift is great, Hunter. Mine is greater, but all things wane, cities fall, so that new ones may rise in their place. You have a calling, and it is my destiny to see that calling done. So there's a moment where they regard each other in the mirror. The oracle takes Hunter's joint from his fingers, smokes a little, watches him, and then she puts her hands on his temples. Hunter, you must speak the will of the oracle. Life is strong, the will is stronger. And then we hear the sound of water, and with firm but gentle effort, Hunter reaches up and lifts her hands away from his head, breaking contact. There is silence. Hunter is suddenly alone. Or is he? He dreams. And when he does, he sees several weary travelers, women who've come to San Francisco and are now trying to get messages back home. An attempt that is staged in the play by the convention of sending messages in bottles out into the sea. There's several of them. Two of them, Annie, is the wife of an abusive gold rush miner from days past, and Cameron, a young woman with a failed startup. So here's a little tiny piece of Annie's voice from the play. Dennis is gone to the fields again, and I confess I am relieved to see him go. But to finance his expedition, he has given up our lodgings, and so your letters, Marie, will find me in a hut in the godless district they call Sydney Town. All the huts here are damp and filthy, thrown together from salvaged shipping timbers. Nothing is built to last because nobody expects to stay. Up and down the alley, women moan and infants whimper, And I am ashamed, Marie, ashamed, and I cannot find the words for what I might do. So that's one of the voices that and visions that Hunter receives. And this is Cameron. Hey, Mom, it's me, Cam. Look, if you're checking voicemail and you get this, never mind. It's not a big deal. And maybe you heard already, but my startup has shut down, like totally down. They took the last of it away this morning, right down to the soap dispensers. But hey, something else will come up. I mean, this is Silicon Valley, right? People gamble and make it all the time. So anyways, I'm sorry. I just, it looks bad. What they said in the news about the pills and everything, I didn't want you to worry. I'm totally fine, you know? Later. So Melanie at first seems like just another one of these figures plaguing Hunter's sleep and waking consciousness until she arrives on his doorstep in the flesh. And Melanie has her own baggage. She's haunted by her mother's unexplained suicide from the Golden Gate Bridge when she was a child. And she's afraid of following in her mother's footsteps. She has recently started falling and she thinks that her vertigo is a sign. And she worries, like many daughters do, that she will become her mother, which for Melanie means getting in a small red Honda one morning and driving off without leaving a note. So in this next piece, Melanie has befriended Moonboy, who's Hunter's kind of lookout sidekick character. And she's waiting for him to get her in to see Hunter so that she can get her oracle. Moonboy is looking through a telescope. He's 16, brilliant, suffers from something akin to a sort of profound agoraphobic anxiety that renders him unable to leave the building. And he uses his mind to travel, and the night sky is the site of his many epic voyages. And Melanie is talking to him while she waits to see Hunter. And she says, don't you ever worry that you're wasting your life and then it could be over? You know, being the mysterious Hunter's lookout, I mean, stuck in this falling down building day in, day out, never going anywhere. Don't you get lonely? Moonboy says, of course not. I have my work. You know, once upon a time, there were dinosaurs roaming the earth. During the day, they hunted each other, hid in swamps, lumbered through thick undergrowth in opaque jungles where nothing else lived. No birds called, not yet. And at night, they would graze and search for water. The smaller ones slept in crevices or vegetation. Did dinosaurs lie down to sleep? Oh, not the big ones, surely. How would they get back up? They probably just slept like horses, standing up one eye at the ready, just in case. But as they dozed beneath the night sky, pulsing with the glow of volcanic ash, somewhere far off in the universe, a star was born. They couldn't see it then, this star, because it was billions of light years away and because the sky was hazy, and plus they had their eyes closed, right? But this is the really cool thing. I can see it. We can see it. The dinosaurs long dead, but the light that left home when they were sleeping is just reaching us now. That twinkle of light has been traveling for billions of years. The star it came from exploded and fizzled out who knows when. But still, the light comes towards us. So when we look up at the night sky, we can see stars that aren't even stars anymore. It's like looking at ghosts. So we're not alone. We're looking right back in time through the barrel of my telescope, back to a map of the universe that belonged to the dinosaurs. And if we can access the past, the continuum that stretches behind us, if we could just figure out how to turn the telescope around, what will we see? So in this last little piece, this is a scene in which Melanie finally gets to meet Hunter. Hunter's had a bad night. His bingo game has not gone well. He's trying to keep the oracle at a distance because he doesn't want her visions and riddles anymore. But that means that she's not giving him numbers either. So he's kind of been taken for everything he's got by some punters and he's not in a good mood. So this is his scene with Melanie. Hunter. Okay, how'd you find me? Melanie. The same way anyone would find you if they really wanted to. I asked around at the psychic fairs. You're legendary. Hunter. Is that right? Melanie. Yes. Hunter. Susceptible to flattery as I may be, I don't believe you. You're probably not the first person to go looking for me and certainly not the brightest, but you're the first one to actually come here in the flesh as you appear to be, so perhaps you can explain that. Melanie. By other people, do you mean the police or those guys who trashed your house back north? Because I don't think the psychics would tell redneck bullies or the police anything. I mean, the police mostly think they're all fakes anyway, so why would they? Hunter, mostly they are all fakes, gossips with a knack for showy generalizations and lucky guesses. Melanie, but you're not. Neither is Gretchen, this clairvoyant in Crescent City. Now, she's not as good as you, and she doesn't do futures. But she told me that you traveled south to hide like Moses among the tall reeds by the water's edge. I figured the tall reeds were buildings, and people come to San Francisco. I know they do. So why not you? Hunter, clever you, though you're not telling me everything and it's late, so. Melanie, look, I've been waiting 2 days to see you, and I came a long way, and I am not the enemy. And you told Moonboy you would be nice to me, remember? You agreed to give a saucer of milk to the stray cat, as you put it. So how about it? My horoscope says I have to grab my chance to learn the truth now before it's too late. Tell me how I die. Hunter, astrology. An imperfect pattern for the suspension of multiple possibilities. Look, Melanie, the gift or whatever it's fashionable to call it these days is a strange and fickle thing. You see a girl breathe in water and then wash up on a beach. You don't necessarily know exactly what or who put her there. Looking that deep into the messy expanse of other people's lives is extremely difficult. Things get bent on their way through the universe, and oracles are complicated and subject to interpretation. Melanie, but you've done it. Hunter, and what did it accomplish? They never found the person who killed that girl. I was branded a freak and a pervert for knowing what I knew and trying to help. They wanted my head on a stick. You know what I want? What I think? I think most of the time the gods prefer us wandering blind. It's sport. So I don't do that anymore. I call bingo. So Melanie contemplates this for a moment, and then she empties her pockets and piles the better part of $5,000 in cash onto the table. Melanie, if you really want to be rid of me, help me. Moonboy wants me to stay, but I won't. You tell me if I'm going to wash up on the beach, and I'll pay you everything I have and then go without a word. I won't tell anyone I found you, and you'll never hear from me again. You and your weird dinosaur math genius out there can stay here and play bingo in peace. Hunter, do you actually know anything about oracles, Melanie? You do realize that you might not be able to do anything about it. Oedipus knew, changed nothing. Melanie, yeah, but I could leave a note. And that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Okay, well, let me start by asking Gail a question. I mean, Aoise is certainly welcome to jump in. I think I know who the real Penelope is. It was in Homer, and I know exactly who that person is, and your Penelope is not her. So it's kind of a shock. So tell me a little bit about the connection.
Well, I don't think I'm the only person who's ever rewritten Penelope. I mean, who really wants to be Penelope? As she says, what woman wants to spend her life being Penelope? So you imagine a little bit more. Also, although, things sort of work out the way they do at the end of the story, people hearing the story must have always thought, he's been gone 20 years. This woman's, maybe was 25 when he left. Now she's this middle-aged woman who hardly knows this husband and has had to look after an estate because that must have been her major function, looking after the state and keeping it from his estate and keeping it from being sort of torn apart. So I always think of her as a figure who had to be shrewd and careful, and the return of her husband, I think, was the last thing she was interested in. She was interested in keeping this together and for her son and so on. Anyway, yes, I think is a figure who is open to a lot of rewriting, and I think a lot of women writers have, in fact, including a lot in Greece, have rewritten Penelope.
So, Aoise, you've written plays about real people. What responsibility do what happens? What do you get to make up do you worry about that?
Oh, you get to make up everything. Really? No, I mean, yes and no. I mean, like Gail, I think, and actually there's a real figure in this play, which is the figure of Annie, who is based on a sort of amalgam of a midwife and another character, another woman, both of whom murdered their husbands and dumped them in the water. And one of them was the wife of a gold miner who was abusive and a drunk. And she was a real person. And so I sort of like took things and then added things in, but it made me think a little bit. One of the reasons I wanted to include her tonight was because of Penelope, because she's a woman also who's like waiting for the husband to come back and doesn't really want him to come back, you know. So I think, you know, there's something there about, for us, women's lives and histories are often somewhat marginal to the stories that get told in some ways, you know. And so I think one of the allures for women writers is to get those real female characters and try and kind of imagine some life into them to try and sort of give back some of the things that have been silenced in the dominant narrative. So that's kind of the joy of it, I think, for me.
Yeah, it was exciting for me to hear you read the play, because I've read it as a script that you sent, or slightly altered, I think, from Dan. But it was so nice to hear it come to life as a piece of theatre, and it worked so well as a play. And it was really lovely to hear you read it.
Oh, thank you. Same with you. I think that's the thing about poetry and plays, right? Is that they're and you're a musician, you know, they're musical. It's nice to hear them.
Yeah. Terribly important.
Yeah, well, in Asia, so you have a bunch of different characters. They belong to different periods of time, different worlds. There's the gold rush. There's someone from the .com world.
Yep.
There's a sort of godlike character in Oracle. They belong in different kinds of stories.
Yep.
What connects them into a single thing?
You know, that's a really good question. I think it's it's unlike some of my other plays that are sort of connected by sort of more solid, you know, narrative links. This is a more thematic play. I think of it as a play that's in a lot of ways about water. So there's a sort of the sort of tidal washing in and out, things just sort of show up and randomly go away again. And one of the things I was interested in was the way that, you know, we're inclined to try and read coincidence as pattern. We're always looking for patterns, you know, trying to make meaning of things. And so I was as I was writing the play, I was thinking a lot about just coincidences when images show up and then they show up again, and what kinds of possibilities for patterns and meaning making those things might generate. So in some ways, the things in the play are deliberately not designed to go together. They do all come together in the end, but I'm not going to tell you how, because that would be a spoiler. So, but thematically, I think they're linked, certainly also in terms of this sense of being alienated from the world and longing for the world, but not being able to be part of it. So there are different kinds of exile and different kinds of longing and different kinds of journeys, but there is an element of that to all of the characters in the story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking at some questions that have come through in the Q&A part here in the chat. Someone wants to know, Gail, how did you learn Greek?
Well, I went to Greece. As simple as that. I went to Greece and fell in love with it, and taught myself Greek and so on. And when I left Greece because of the coup d'etat, I decided to go to London, and I joined a group of Greeks there that were opposed to the dictatorship. And I bought a detective story in Greek. I knew how to speak it by this time, but I certainly couldn't read and write it. So I bought a detective story, a real sort of Agatha Christie style detective story. And I read it with a dictionary from cover to cover. And by the end of that time, I knew how to at least read Greek. Because it was more interesting than just learning it out of a textbook. That's the way I do things.
Okay, a question to both of you. Did you have a sense as you moved from place to place that you would finally settle somewhere? So can you imagine living a satisfying life without setting down roots somewhere?
Gosh, Aisha.
How long have you been in Ithaca, Gail? How long have you been here?
40 years.
Okay. You got me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm at 15 or something, I think. So
you're quite a long time too. And I've got a perfectly straightforward story. I met a guy and followed him to here. But what's your story?
Sort of somewhat similar, I suppose. My husband took a job at Cornell, and we'd been in California. I lived in San Francisco for a while, and it was sort of, that play actually came out of needing to be, like, I couldn't write the play until I'd left San Francisco and I was somewhere else. So this question of putting down roots is an interesting one, because I think sometimes, like, I was really struck by your poem, Gail, The Lucky Country. I've taken that same trip, maybe not to Greece, but like across the country from west to east and east to west. And the sort of idea that you don't really know a place until you can get some distance on it, I think is a really poignant one, particularly when we're thinking about journeys, right? And that this sort of longing for home, and when you're away from home, you're sort of thinking about it and you're able to write about it in a different way. So I don't know. I mean, Ithaca is the longest I've ever lived anywhere. Yeah. The house I'm in now is the longest I've ever lived anywhere. So we'll see. We'll see.
The last thing I ever expected was to end up in America. I thought I was a Greek and that I lived in Greece. I mean, I'd sort of become a secondhand Greek, and that was the place that I felt that I belonged. And leaving it to come to America seemed so strange. But when my husband told me that he lived in a town called Ithaca, I thought, this is fate. Yeah.
Next best thing. It's not Greece, but it's close enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I remember how Aisha and I met, actually. So we met at a play festival.
Yeah, that's
up in
right.
Upstate New York.
Yep.
And then a few years later, I sent her an email because I'd read a good review of something of hers. Yeah. And she sent back an email saying, "Oh, thanks. I live in Ithaca now. Don't you live in Ithaca?"
That's right. Yeah, that's right. We met before I moved here. Yep.
Okay, the next question is for either of you. Could you discuss the differences between leaving home and coming home? Which is harder? Which is more common in stories, and which is more interesting to write about?
I don't know. I mean, leaving home has always got this nice sense of adventure about it. I think when you're young, that you like stories about leaving home and maybe never coming back and going off for an adventure. I think coming home for some people is very difficult because it's never the same place that they come back to it, especially if they've been gone for years. They come back and I don't know. I think that for me, I was somebody that loved the idea of leaving home and going on adventures. And I thought my life would be always traveling here and there and so on. I don't know about you, Aisha, but my feeling is that it's much easier to think about leaving than the coming home bit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it has a lot to do with this idea of the future, right? That, my play is sort of like thinking a lot about this anxiety that people feel about what the future holds for them. And when you're leaving somewhere, you don't know what the future holds, but you're at the beginning of something. When you're coming back, you still don't know what the future holds and you're at the end of something. And I think, I think you're right. I think coming home is really hard. When I go home now to Australia, I get off the plane, I'm like, oh, it's so nice to be home. All those Australian accents, and my family listens to me and they're like, you sound like a Yank, mate. What happened to you over there?
Yeah.
They think I sound really American, and I use the wrong words for things. I say, I need to go to the gas station and put petrol in my car. And, there's sort of no going back now. I think it's tricky. It's definitely tricky.
Yeah. I think Ithaca's full of people that don't really belong. Ithaca's such a, being a university town in America where people all travel around anyway, it doesn't seem to me that that people need to put down roots here, because it's full of people who are temporarily, or they think they're temporarily. Like I thought I was temporarily living in Ithaca and that we would set off for somewhere else. So it's rather nice that Ithaca doesn't feel like a stuck place to me, although one might say that 40 years is being stuck. But I don't feel that Ithaca is a place where you get stuck.
Yeah, lucky for us, right? I mean, for some people, I think it is. So we're fortunate that we still feel like we have some liberties to come and go.
Yes.
My kids were born here, and so my kids, for my kids, it's like Ithaca is everything. It's like, no, we're Ithacans. We live here. They're like,
That's
yeah,
right.
we're Australians. We're born in Ithaca, duh. So it's, it's
Yeah,
confusing for them.
my kids are the same, very Ithacan.
Yeah, totally.
Well, let me go back to my obsession with the real Penelope.
Oh, yeah.
So at the very end, there's a very sort of poignant scene. So all the action is over, but they don't just fall into one another's arms. They circle each other very warily and very cleverly. And that's just a very striking scene. That's just another way in which, in which Homer's Penelope is not your Penelope.
On the other hand, she's the one who's testing more than he is. She is tremendously smart about testing him, and she's wary. And yes, they fall into each other's arms eventually, but there's a lot of testing. And it's very interesting that not only women, but you think about Tennyson, or you think about Kazantzakis, or people who've written sort of a sequel to the Odyssey. The first thing they think, as male readers, I think, is that Odysseus himself is going to be as restless as anything sitting on this island. He can't wait to get back to sea. And Tennyson's Ulysses and Kazantzakis's The Odyssey, a modern sequel, both have him setting out in a very short time to go on more adventures, because it may be the thing he thinks he's been dying to get back to, but when he gets there, is a man like that ever going to be satisfied with settling down with this middle-aged lady he once married 20 years ago?
Okay, here, a question addressed to both writers. Says, water appears importantly in the sections both read, Gail in the last poem and Aoise in the bottled messages. So would you tell us how you think about and use that image of water in your work? Of course, in Homer, water is a way of transportation, but it's also a mode of communication and survival in both of the things we just heard.
Yeah, it is. And for me, it's one of the really important things in that play. When I think about the language in the play, one of the things I was trying to explore was sort of the water as a sort of like an ebb and a flow in the language and the words and the dialogue as a sort of way of thinking about water as this sort of fluid, unstable, ever moving thing that brings people closer together and further apart. And it sort of depends a little bit. When I was living in San Francisco, I was really struck by kind of the anxiety about earthquakes, right? I remember one time sitting in a cafe, and this truck came rumbling down Bush Street, like however many miles an hour, boom, 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 and everybody in the cafe stopped and looked up, like, oh my God, was that the big one? And then, oh no, it's just a truck, and they went back to what they were doing. And I was absolutely terrified. I was like, oh my God, it's just like things are going to fall over. And one of the things that's really interesting about that city is that if you're on a bridge going over the water when an earthquake hits, there's sort of some nervousness about that. So water for me was sort of one of these things that was sort of both safe passage, but also a place that felt sort of potentially always just a little bit dangerous. And of course, coming from Australia, we're surrounded by water. It's a coastal place. So I think water really feels like one of those things that's nice fodder for writers, because it's not just one thing, and it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It always has the potential to move in either direction. So
yeah, well, I got tremendously interested in water, and for 10 years I did a lot of work on water shortages in the Mediterranean. I was sort of in charge of this program of Mediterranean studies, and I said, I'm going to do water, and people, including my husband, said, you don't know anything about water. And so I said, no, I don't know anything about water. But I'd learned a lot about water. I worked with a hydrologist, a professor at Cornell, and the two of us taught a course together. I did the culture, he did the nitty-gritty of water science. And together we did this program. We went to Greece several times and worked there, and we had conferences, and I got to think about water all the time, and it came into my writing as well. And what I thought about in that poem, Flying Over the Lucky Country, was that the Aboriginals, like the Greeks, like everybody who lives in a really dry, deserty landscape, they know the value of water, and they regard it as the most precious thing that you could imagine. In fact, I was rather upset when somebody said to me, somebody mentioned that he'd met you and you were like a glass of cold water. And I thought, how awful, a glass of cold water. I don't. But apparently, I learned later that this was, a precious thing. To be like a glass of water is to be refreshing and young and whatever I was at the time. So water has, as you say, all these different meanings, but in dry places, it becomes the most precious thing you could imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can't go for very long without it. Yeah, true.
Okay, a question for Gail. How does translation influence the poems you write in English and your sense of how to use English?
Oh, a lot. I mean, I'm thinking in translation terms all the time, because I do a lot of translation, and I translate my own poetry. And I've just written actually a kid's book in Greek. I try to, sort of write in Greek as well as translate, but translation, I think, made me into a poet. I don't think I'd have become a poet without translation. I translated so many poets I really liked, and then I thought, God, I can maybe do this myself. Before that, I'd been in awe of these poets I translated, because they were well-known Greek poets. And then I thought, yes, I'm going to have a go at this craft and teach myself. But I did learn a lot from translation. You read so carefully when you're translating. It's quite a different experience of reading. So yes, it influenced me a lot.
A question for Aisha. When do you expect Oracle to premiere?
That's a good question. This has been a hard birth, this play. It's taken a lot of years. I don't know. It had a workshop recently. I went to University of Connecticut and worked on it there with a dramaturg and a great bunch of students, actually. And it was fantastic. And that was how the play more or less ended up in its final shape. But then COVID happened. And yeah, so short answer, no idea. One day, I hope. I'd like to see it done someday.
Okay, question. Let's see. How does leaving home look from the perspective of a year of COVID lockdown?
Yeah, I just responded to this one in the chat, and I said it looks delightful and impossible. I think that's another kind of exile. That's feeling cut off from your ability, your freedom to move around, or it's flipped to say house arrest, obviously, because we're not in any way in that sort of circumstance. But I think I've become much more appreciative of what I took for granted, which was the ability to just go and do things and be like, oh yeah, let's take a trip. Let's let's go for a drive and go camping or something. And now everything just seems so impossibly difficult in terms of getting around. So it's made me much more appreciative of what I took for granted. Like you, Gail, I thought I would always be traveling. I love it. Australians are big travelers. It's because we're so far away from everything, and so to be reminded that that's a luxury that you don't necessarily get in this life, I think was probably a good reminder, actually, not to take that for granted. It's a privilege. It's a privilege to travel,
Indeed.
For some of us it is.
But isn't it also the time where you realize, I often think of people who have no inner resources. We write, other people paint, they do mathematics, whatever they do. But if you don't have that sort of inner world, if your life is dependent on contact with other people and going shopping or whatever you want to do out there in the world, I always think it must be so difficult to have gone through this year of COVID, because you'd go nuts. I keep saying, thanking my lucky stars, I have something that occupies me during the day and that I can think about. And traveling, I travel in my head half the time.
Yeah, writing helps with that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been scolded for not naming the people whose questions I'm speaking. So that's too late for some of them, but here's one from Neil. Gail, you mentioned that many women have rewritten Penelope. can you tell us a bit more about some other fantasies than yours?
Well, yes, one group of poems that was written by my very dear late friend Katerina Angelaki, who was Greece's leading woman poet. She wrote about Penelope, and her view of Penelope was that she wasn't weaving, she was writing. And so she turned her craft of making poems into Penelope's weaving. And it was more personal, about her own personal life than mine. I was more, I think, more interested in the whole story and the war and excuses for war and so on. But her story was about Penelope. And a woman prose writer who I know well, who's written that, made no attempt to link her Penelope stories to anything obvious. Penelope was just a figure dependent really for her life on men, but otherwise there was nothing, no reference. She's a Greek woman who knows these stories well, but she made no direct reference to any of it. It was just, you had to, reading the stories, understand what she meant by Penelope. In each case, you realized that in some way she was dependent on a man for the rest of her life.
Okay, we got time for one more question, a very quick answer from both of you. What fiction do you read and recommend?
Everything. I read all the time, but I'm trying to read fiction in Italian at the moment, because during COVID I taught myself Italian, not terribly well, but I've been working on doing the same as I did with Greek and just reading novels one after another. I'm reading Elena Ferranti at the moment in Italian, so that's what it slows me down. Otherwise I read 3 books a day, but if I can read in a foreign language, I can slow myself down a bit.
It's a good way to slow down the book consumption. I like it. I'll have to try that. I wish I had more time to read fiction. I have 3 children and full-time job, and I love to read. And most recent thing I read was actually a lightweight, but still very good, Leanne Moriarty novel. She's an Australian novelist.
Yes.
But I read a lot of plays at the moment. I'm reading tons of plays. I just finished reading Sherry Moraga's The Hungry Woman, a Mexican Medea, which is really interesting. So I'm challenging myself to try and read a play a week this year. That's my goal.
Good, yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks to you both. And everybody, please note that the next of our sessions will be on March 16th at 7 p.m. with Raza Rumi and Soraya Khan, both of them from Pakistan. So there's links on the website or on the library events calendar. And I see John has put a link in the chat. So we'll say thanks to everybody and good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.